Okay, everybody, I think we'll start, please. Have some silence. Begin the second session on day 2 on strategic objectives and whole of plan matters dealing with the combined Wairarapa district plan. We're up to submitter number 6 for the day, which is Fulton Hogan, and Fulton Hogan are represented by Mr. Tim Ensor. Welcome, Mr. Ensor. You hear us now?
I can, thank you very much, and
Apologies
for. Oh, I think it was on my end, so apologies are all mine.
Okay. We're running a tad late, so thank you for your indulgence there. We've read your statement of evidence that was pre-circulated and dated the 20th of July. You don't have a summary statement at all, Mr. Ensor?
I have some sort of key points that I could highlight if that's of use to you, but I'm in your hands there. The brief of evidence isn't particularly long, so look, whatever works for you best, really.
Well, we would benefit from a high level key points that are still a contest for you, in the sense that you would have you had an opportunity to see the summary statement that was prepared by the officers. It's day 1 of this.
I haven't. Apologies. No.
Okay. Well, that's a little bit disappointing because the process is a live process, and the submitters have moved. The officers have recommended some changes to the 42A reports, but we'll just have to wing that, I guess. You take us through the main points, and we'll see if we've got any questions.
Thank you very much. Just on that summary, was that circulated via email, was it?
No, it was posted on the web page.
Okay. Yes, that's right. So we've just got an overzealous mail filter at the moment, and I was just hoping that it hadn't ended up in there instead. Thank you.
It's probably something that I'll repeat during the course of the hearing, but submitters and all parties are well aware of what's on the web page, and it's almost, you need to go into that daily just to see what's happening. But at the end of each day, any representative will be posted on the web page, and the summary statements from officers for each hearing will be lodged on that web page also.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Well,
thank you. I guess the first sort of point which I'd just like to raise is just the importance of aggregate and in general, but also in the district, and I guess the cost advantages of having aggregate sources close to the point at which they're used, and this point's actually recognised in the regional policy statement as well. Objective 31 and policy 60 touch on this. And another key point that sort of that is useful to keep in mind when talking about aggregate is that it's location specific, and so it does have some limitations as to where it can occur, and this is where I guess sort of key strategic land use planning comes in. Largely aggregate resources in rural environments, so that is of I guess interest to Fulton Hogan through its submissions. Fulton Hogan was supportive of the recognition through the Objective 1, RE1, the recognition of the rural environment, but was also keen to understand or see reflection of some of the activities that go on in the rural environment rather than just the environment itself in that objective. And I guess my view is that would be of assistance to minimise kind of unintended consequences or policy consequences down the track. A key challenge with quarrying activities is sort of interaction with inappropriate activities, adjacent land uses, but also in the context of the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land, the sort of access to the resource generally, Fulton Hogan's submission sought amendments to, or support of, and amendments to RE Objective 2 and RE 03 to include, I guess, a reflection of the MPS HPL as to what might be inappropriate in the context of highly productive land. And in my view, the clarifications around that are a helpful way to give effect to the MPS down in this district plan, and to sort of limit the risk that maybe a narrow interpretation of some policies or objectives and policies in this plan, and what that risk might pose to access to aggregate resource. Once again, in relation to the rural environment, the character of the rural environment is expressed through RE Objective 4. Now, this may have been something that's amended, and apologies once again, but the office had recommended that that objective was amended to include rural amenity along with rural character. And I guess in my evidence, I expressed some challenges with doing that at a strategic level without having a robust discussion as to what contributes to rural character. And so at this stage, my view is that amenity should be left out of this, and that the overall character should be the matter that's discussed. I touched on adjacent activities, and reverse sensitivity is where this issue mainly lands. Fulton Hogan has sought some amendments around avoiding reverse sensitivity effects to make it very clear that is a key consideration when planning urban growth, and when planning for activities that may be incompatible. The potential significance, I suppose, of not addressing this issue properly is that you may end up with the access to the resource being curtailed where it could provide otherwise an advantage for the well-being of the community. And this sort of approach gives effect to policy 60 in the RPS. Fulton Hogan was also supportive of defining reverse sensitivity. And the last point probably is just in relation to infrastructure and the role that aggregate resource plays in providing for infrastructure. Focuses generally on the role infrastructure plays, the challenges with siting it in the environment, but one thing that Fulton Hogan is noticing more and more is that that access to resource for this for infrastructure, meeting infrastructure objectives or aspirations for a district is also contributing quite significantly. It has potential to contribute to the cost of that, and in my evidence, I allude to some of the challenges associated with transportation of aggregate being a sort of low cost but high volume product. So those are the sort of key points that I wanted to highlight, and I'm happy to take questions on any of that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ensor. I've got a copy of Mr. Wesney's summary statement in front of me where he addresses the various matters of relief that Fulton Hogan have asked for, and I'm just going to give you the references in relation to RE 01, Mr. paragraph 19, the reference.
Yes.
And in that paragraph, Mr. Wesney acknowledges the concern that you've got about not differentiating between activities in that objective. But he maintains that the broad wording is still appropriate and believes that the the ability to differentiate between those matters is best dealt with in the rural chapter. So I'll leave you to ponder that. In relation to REO2 and REO3 regarding productive capacity and highly productive land, paragraphs 20 from 22 reference the concern there, and Mr. Wesley has recommended a change based on a submission by Meridian, and he concludes that he believes that the wording that is proposed by Ms. Foster of Meridian provides with some clarity and addresses the matters that were raised by yourself and Mr. Matthews of Genesis on that matter. So again, I'll leave you to ponder that.
Thank you.
On the matter of character and amenity values, Mr. Wesley hasn't acknowledged your concerns regarding the reference to amenity values. He's maintained his position on that, and again believes that the subsequent chapters, particularly dealing with the general rural zone and the rural lifestyle zone, are the appropriate means for dealing with those concerns that you've raised in relation to that. And I also should acknowledge that the definition of reverse sensitivity is something that's been addressed by Ms. Robertson in her report. Ms. Robertson was faced with a number of competing definitions.
Yes.
And she's landed on a definition that was proposed by an emergency, I believe. Kiwi Rail. And again, there's a significant discussion in her summary statement in relation to that. I can give you the reference if you like. No, I can't. I don't have it in front of me.
That's okay. I mean, and I was supportive of KiwiRail's amendments there.
Yeah.
So I can check to see whether there's anything shifted. But
Yes.
If it hasn't, I was pretty comfortable with where KiwiRail's had taken that definition.
Yes, and on the final matter regarding Mr. Wesley has maintained his original position largely in terms of the 42A report. So we will have we'll receive from the officers a right of reply, because we've asked Mr. Wesley and Ms. Robertson to come back to us on a number of matters raised in their supplementary. And you might want to, if you want to get a better feel for the discussion, the recording of day one is online.
Appreciate that.
You'll see some of the questions that the panel put to both of those authors. I'll just check and see if there are any further questions. No. What I'm doing, Ms. Densel, I'm just checking with the officers to see whether they have any questions of clarification, not cross-examination, but questions of clarification. Anything? No.
One matter, just if you're willing, Chair. The recommendations I've made to REO2 and REO3,
yes,
in response to the evidence from Eastleigh, from Ms. Foster, and my response was that they address the points made by Mr. Ensor and his evidence. But if you indulge Mr. Ensor the ability to come back to you in writing, just whether the recommendation is appropriate from his perspective, or whether he sees alternative being both what Eastleigh have raised and he's raising on behalf of Fulton.
Okay.
That might just round out.
Thank you for that, Mr. Wesley. I actually incorrectly referenced, I think I was talking about Ms. Foster's evidence for Meridian. It should have been Eastleigh, paragraph 20. But so the question that you
was whether you want to give Mr. Ensor the ability to come back to you to confirm whether the recommended wording for REO2 and RE addresses.
Yes. Yes. Would you be willing to do that, Mr. Ensor?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. We would need to receive that by Friday, the 16th of August.
No, that's absolutely no problem.
And that will enable the officers to consider your response and reflect on that and give us their recommendation and their final right of reply.
I appreciate that opportunity. Thank you.
Good point. That's good. Okay, well, I think if that's everything, we can thank you for your attendance, and no doubt we'll see you in subsequent hearings, particularly in the zone.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Okay. You must be Emily Levison.
I am.
And you're representing Horticulture New Zealand.
Correct.
Thank you. Just give us a minute, Emily, while we just get papers in order. There's a lot of them. Summary statement at all, Ms. Levison?
I'm planning to speak to one, yes.
Yes. Do you have one printed out?
I don't, I apologize.
Okay. For subsequent hearings, should you attend, it would be useful. Just allows the panel to focus on what you're saying rather than trying to record the matters in writing. So
Noted.
would you be able to email a copy of that to Ruth?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Let me just find you a statement of. Got it. You're the yellow tab. Okay, we're in your hands. Please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Emily Levinson, and I'm an environmental policy advisor at Horticulture New Zealand. I have the responsibility to look after district and regional planning processes on behalf of fruit and vegetable growers in the Wairarapa. Horticulture New Zealand submits on plans to ensure that provisions work for existing growers and also to future-proof plans for any horticultural expansion or new businesses. Wairarapa has a strong history of horticulture, and there are at least 20 commercial fruit and vegetable growers who currently operate in the area. The region is very well suited to growing in terms of the climate and the soil, but environmental factors alone are not enough to foster a thriving local horticulture industry. The future of the sector in the Wairarapa will depend on preventing urban sprawl onto highly productive land, the management of reverse sensitivity effects, support for ancillary activities to horticulture like packhouses, and access to fresh water. And I'll be addressing all of these concerns at the last in my presentation today. Horticulture brings a lot of benefits to the Wairarapa. The fruits and vegetables grown here provide healthy food for local residents and Wellington City. And they're also sold throughout the North Island and beyond for export. This generates economic value for the region, and growers also employ local residents, backpackers, and workers from overseas who are part of the communities here. Growing in the Wairarapa is an incredibly low emissions activity. Its small carbon footprint mostly comes from freight, farm vehicles, and fertilizer use. Support for existing horticulture and diversification into new horticultural activities will help the district councils manage agricultural emissions as directed under proposed Plan Change 1 of the Wellington Regional Policy Statement. The recently developed Wellington Regional Food System Plan had a key vision for a regulatory environment that supports Kai resilience, wellness, and fairness. Today, I'll discuss how the Combined District Plan's strategic direction can support that vision. So I'd like to start by talking about highly productive land. Hort NZ supports that the Combined District Plan seeks to implement the National Policy Statement for highly productive land to the extent practicable, and will continue to seek provisions in line with that NPS throughout these hearing streams. Hort NZ supported RE03 in our submission, and I'm concerned that the amendments proposed to this objective in the reporting officer's summary statement on strategic direction are not aligned with the objective of the National Policy Statement for highly productive land. That objective in the NPS is that highly productive land is protected for use in land-based primary production, both now and for future generations. The summary statement amendments have the objective instead reading that highly productive land is protected from inappropriate subdivision use and development, rather than protected full stop. And its use for use in land-based primary production, both now and for future generations, is enabled. And I see enabled as a bit of, not quite as strong of a term as protected, which is in the NPS. So I see that RE02 and RE03 are distinct in focus and should not be combined. Protecting productive capacity is about the ability of highly productive land to be used for productive purpose. So that includes the physical, legal, and spatial planning constraints that might affect the ability to actually use that land for a productive purpose like horticulture. So I see reverse sensitivity as one of these significant constraints to productive capacity that needs to be addressed in order for that land to actually be used for its best and highest use. Protecting highly productive land itself is about ensuring that land exists for current and future generations to use for primary production when they wish to. And so that is more about concerns like paving over that land or covering it with housing. Reverse sensitivity is a serious concern in the Wairarapa. There's a tension now between expanding housing availability and protecting the ability to use productive land to grow fruits and vegetables for domestic food supply and for high value, low emissions export. This does not have to be a zero-sum game. Common sense provisions like setbacks can manage reverse sensitivity effects on horticulture while still providing for housing growth. But it's worth noting that horticulture does often occur at that urban-rural fringe, and that's where that tension takes place. And so throughout the plan, we'll be seeking amendments to provisions to ensure that interface is managed in a way that allows both activities to thrive.
That'll be primarily in the rural zone and rural lifestyle zones, presumably.
Primarily, yeah. HortNZ sees an opportunity to support this goal through objectives, including at the urban-rural fringe. And as discussed in my evidence, there may need to be some objectives and provisions in the urban chapters to manage the effects at that boundary, including in the future urban zone. In our submission, we also sought recognition of activities to support primary production, either through RE01 or a new objective. And those ancillary activities are ones like pack houses or small-scale rural retail that are essential for the functioning of the horticulture industry. The broad term land use activities proposed by the reporting officer in RE01 isn't specific enough to recognize these particular ancillary activities support the purpose of the rural environment, which is to provide for primary production and accompanying activities. So in conclusion, Horticulture New Zealand continues to seek a strategic framework that supports current and future local food production and the economic, social, and environmental well-being of the Wairarapa. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about horticulture in these districts and look forward to working with you throughout this hearing process.
Thank you, Ms. Levinson, and thank you for taking the opportunity to read the summary statements. I think previous submitter didn't get that opportunity, and I think we need to look at our procedures for making sure that all submitters are aware that those summary statements are available, and that's something the panel will discuss offline with. It's possible that we'll send out an email advising parties that when the summary statements are available. But thank you for your initiative in doing that. I just want to focus on the RE02 and 03 matters, how they relate to the NPS for highly productive land. One of your main concerns is the way in which those two objectives have been qualified in a sense by addition of the words from inappropriate subdivision use and development. The APL is reasonably new. It's the last couple of years. Have you seen that approach adopted elsewhere in your role for Horticulture New Zealand and other district plan reviews around the country?
In terms of inserting the language around inappropriate, yeah, we've definitely seen that language in objectives and policies elsewhere, but I don't think it's necessary or adds clarity. I think the objective in the NPS HPL as it stands is fairly clear.
Yes. Mr. Wesney, in response to a question from the panel on day one, told us about what the role of the strategic direction objectives are, and that's first and foremost to have an outcome statement, a goal, but also he talked about the need for them to reflect particular circumstances of the Wairarapa, and I just wondered whether, in that sense, whether the addition of the words have some sort of purchase in that sense.
I do think that inappropriate subdivision use and development would be the biggest concern when it comes to highly productive land, but could go into even more detail if you wanted to and add reverse sensitivity as another concern in there. And you could add every other problem that might occur for highly productive lands. And I think that's something that sits better in the policies, and that's how it's written in the NPS HPL. And the high level objective that exists in the NPS allows room to go into that detail.
Okay, so in other words, the rural chapters and the rural lifestyle chapters, and to a certain extent the urban chapters, could nuance that.
Yes.
So how would you have that? Are you going to provide a track change version?
So we supported the REO 3 as it was drafted.
Yes.
Just highly productive land is protected for use in land-based primary production. That one is directly from the NPS HPL. Yes. And then in REO 2, in my evidence, I proposed some amendments just for clarity. And I think that I would stand by those amendments, even seeing the summary statement.
Okay. What about the addition of the words "is enabled" in REO 3? What's the particular concern there?
I don't think that enabled is quite as strong as protected. I think it's important that we need to protect that resource, especially since it's something not just for this generation, but for future ones, as stated in the NPS, that it needs a bit more active effort to ensure that it remains for that future use.
Yes, so the first words there are highly productive land is protected. Mm-hmm. Forget about the inappropriate subdivision use at the moment. For land-based primary production, both now and for future generations, full stop. Is that how you'd prefer to see it read?
I think so, yes. I see the way that it's written in the summary report. It says its use for land-based primary production, both now and for future generations, is enabled.
Yes.
Rather than that use for primary production being protected.
Okay. The other question I had, Stevenson, was, and you've touched on this in terms of your comments on reverse sensitivity. There's been some recommendations from Ms. Robertson on a definition of reverse sensitivity. Did Horticulture New Zealand, I think Horticulture New Zealand did submit on that, didn't they? And they were, yes. Comment on the summary statements position on that definition?
I don't have any written down at the moment. I might have to remind myself of what.
Ms. Robertson has adopted the Kiwi Rail, has recommended that we adopt the Kiwi Rail definition of reverse sensitivity.
And was that the same one that was in the draft plan?
No, it wasn't. Okay. It's a similar definition to what exists in the Wellington City Plan, I believe.
I would say I can't see it in front of me, but the main thing we'd be interested in a definition of reverse sensitivity is making sure that it encompasses both the reverse sensitivity on infrastructure, which is one concern that often comes up in plans, but also on primary production, and just making sure it's drafted in a way that supports both of those, because I believe the reason that the definition was removed in the draft plan and the notified plan was because of some confusion around those two different times that it's applied.
Yes, you're right. It was removed between the draft and the notified, and now recommended to be reinserted, but using different wording. Okay. I've exhausted my questions. I'll just check with the panel. Any questions?
Thank you. I've just got one on your the definitions of water body. I'd really like to understand why you want to exclude water raters. I've read that, but it doesn't. You say let's exclude them, but I just want to test your reasoning for that a little bit more.
I think it comes down to how the definition of surface water body is applied throughout the plan. So down in the natural character and public access chapters, it's described just the general term surface water body is used, and it's discussed with natural character, ecological, cultural, amenity, and recreational values. And particularly in those policies and rules that relate to the recreational use, it seems like those that artificial water races and artificial channels don't necessarily fit with those other surface water bodies and those rules and provisions. And also when it comes to setbacks, I would imagine that you might need larger setbacks from natural water bodies than those that are artificial. And that distinction should be made further down the plan. And then also there was the issue with the what can be considered a significant water body. I don't see a circumstance where an artificial channel or water race should be able to fit under that definition, which it does as it's all drafted at this moment.
Even if it's hundreds of kilometres long, it's not significant.
Not for the purposes of that term in the plan.
Any further questions of Ms. Leveson?
I'm fine.
Oh, thank you for your time, Ms. Leveson.
Thank you very much.
Just so you know, the officer's right to reply will be available in, I think, 15 working days, isn't he, from the close of the hearing?
Thank you.
And you'll email the document through to the hearings administration.
Will do.
Thank you. Well, amazingly, we're keeping a resemblance to the timetable. We're running about 5 minutes late, which isn't too bad. It is the Greater Wellington Regional Council. I'd like to come up to the front table. Welcome, Ms. Zollner. A few minutes. We've got a lot of paper from you. So do you have any summary statement?
Sorry. Up some quick speaking notes
Okay.
in response to hearing summary statements, but I can circulate them.
I'm pleased to hear that you've read the hearing summary statement, and I understand you've had some discussion with Ms. Foster too, which is to be encouraged. I appreciate you doing that, and I'm not sure who reached out to who, but certainly that's a practice we certainly encourage as a panel. So thank you for that. Now, just give us a couple of minutes while we get organised. Okay, now what we have in front of us is two briefs of evidence from yourself, one on freshwater management, and I think the other one's on a variety of matters, including urban form development and transportation. We also have legal submissions prepared by DLA Piper. We've read all that material. You would have heard that we tested some of the matters in the legal submissions with the officers on Tuesday. We're in your hands. You've got 25 minutes. Make the most of it.
I'll just do a short intro.
And so your name is?
Sam O'Brien.
Sam O'Brien?
Yeah. Tēnā koutou panel, or Sam O'Brien Tukuinga. I'm a policy advisor at the Greater Wellington Regional Council. Today, obviously I'm joined by Senior Policy Advisor Mika Zollner. In the front row here as well, we also have Policy Advisor Josie Knight-McLean and our Policy Manager Nicola Arneson. Who have all contributed to Greater Wellington's submission. I'd like to thank the panel for the opportunity to speak to Greater Wellington's Regional Council's submission and further submission, and thank you to the hearings team for their great work as well. Greater Wellington recognises the significant work by officers across all councils and all those involved in developing the proposed district plan, and congratulates the team on their work today. Greater Wellington is generally supportive of the plan and look forward to the opportunity to provide input today and across future hearing streams. Our submission and evidence is supported by legal evidence tabled on behalf of Greater Wellington by DLA Piper, which covers proposed change 1 to the regional policy statement and the national policy statement for freshwater management. This legal evidence responds directly to the arguments set out in the Section 42A reports for hearing stream 1, but will also be relevant in future hearing streams, and we will refer back to that when understood relevant. Yes, so Ms. Zollner will now speak to her expert evidence on freshwater and urban development, transport and climate resilience. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou commissioners, ko Mika tēnā tōku ingoa, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I've prepared two briefs of evidence on behalf of Greater Wellington. talk to today, one on freshwater matters and one on urban development, or one that focuses on urban development. My qualifications and experience are outlined in my evidence. So I'd just like to thank the reporting officers for their work to date in responding to both submissions and the evidence. So just as a brief introduction, I suppose I'll just outline that the implementation of of regional and national policy direction generally forms the basis of Greater Wellington's submission across the district plan. The evidence I'll discuss today focuses in particular on implementation of or consistency with the MPS for freshwater management, the MPS on urban development, and the regional policy statement, both operative and proposed. So I'll take my evidence as read, and I'll just briefly summarise its key points that were made in each statement and focus in particular on some of the discussion on Tuesday and the hearings statements.
Most useful.
So my evidence on freshwater management sought addition of a new Three Waters chapter into the combined district plan, and I'll address this first. So my evidence was structured into three key arguments. Firstly, why the combined district plan has a role in avoiding, remedying and mitigating the potential adverse effects of urban development on freshwater. Secondly, why the existing direction in the subdivision and zones chapters that are in the combined district plan currently don't quite achieve this role. And thirdly, how the relief sought in Greater Wellington's submission could be refined in response to the concerns that have been raised. So in their hearing summary statement, the reporting officer has outlined some reasons why they don't support a new Three Waters chapter, according to each of these arguments. So I'll just provide some further comment on these responses in turn. So firstly, the reporting officer maintains the view that the provisions provided are more within the ambit of regional council responsibilities. I don't agree with this view, and I outline this in paragraphs 30 to 34 of my evidence, where I address why district plans do have a role in freshwater, and this is specifically through the way that zoning and subdivision influences the location and form of urban development. I'll also highlight the tabled legal submissions, which my colleague Sam has mentioned, which specifically address the role of territorial authorities under the MPSFM. I'll also just note that there is now an operative example of a district plan taking a role in freshwater through the Wellington City Council district plan. Secondly, the reporting officer considers that the current combined district plan provisions already appropriately manage Three Waters in the Wairarapa. The reporting officer has included provisions in from the combined district plan into an appendix and points out that there are additional provisions which I did not identify. I just wish to briefly clarify that a lot of these duplicate the same Three Waters servicing direction, and I just focused on the general residential zone chapter, but those standards and rules are reflected throughout other zones and precincts across the district plan. So my view, which I've outlined in paragraphs 37 to 41 of my evidence, which is that the existing provisions generally relate more to the managing the connections to the Three Waters network and managing appropriate infrastructure capacity. And they make some very high level references to water bodies and policies. My view hasn't changed that this doesn't necessarily seek to specifically manage downstream effects on freshwater. The reporting officer also identifies that a Section 32AA evaluation of the provisions is lacking. My evidence identifies in several places why I consider the provisions I'm proposing to be the most effective and efficient option for the PDP, the Combined District Plan. However, if the panel would like me to prepare a more fulsome Section 32AA evaluation, then I'm happy to do so.
Yes, we can give you some direction on that now. We would want that in the fullness of time, but I'll be suggesting another procedure that might occur before that. So I'll come back to that.
Okay. And then finally, and this is probably I'll spend a little bit more time on, the reporting officer has stated that the context in the Wairarapa is different to other parts of the region, and therefore stormwater management for water quality and quantity and hydraulic neutrality are less important in the Wairarapa. The reasons given for this are that the Wairarapa is less densely developed, has more capacity for ground storage and has less impermeable surface areas. Generally, I disagree with this, and I'll elaborate on why. So in paragraphs 35 and 36 of my evidence, I outline why stormwater effects from urban development remain an important consideration for urban development in the Wairarapa. In my opinion, this district plan is actually a really good opportunity to take some pressure off the freshwater receiving environments in the Wairarapa. In the context of an integrated management approach, they're getting pressure from other aspects as well, and taking some of the pressure from urban development from the urban areas is a really good opportunity. And I think that this, if we look at the whole freshwater catchment across the Wairarapa, that direction for integrated management comes through from the Ruamahanga Waitua implementation plan. So the first point I'd just like to make on this is that the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management and the RPS direction on stormwater, which includes in the operative RPS through Policy 42, applies to all urban development. And so therefore it applies to the Wairarapa regardless. And the second point I'd like to make is that this relief is talking about the urban areas of the Wairarapa where there is urban development occurring. And we know that it's occurring both within the towns and on the outskirts of the towns. Within these towns, there are urban residential densities that compare to many other parts of the region. And there may also possibly be higher densities coming through this district plan process. As this aside, population density and built form density does not necessarily reflect the level of imperviousness and the generation of urban contaminants, which are the actual concern from a stormwater effects perspective. So you could have a pretty low density area that still has a lot of driveways, carports, roofs, roads that are generating contaminants and increasing the imperviousness of that area, and therefore leading to an altered hydrology and the generation of stormwater contaminants. On the flip side, you could also have quite high density areas that have a lot of permeable surface. So in my experience of the Wairarapa, the urban parts of the Wairarapa don't look particularly different to a lot of other suburban parts of the region. So the final point I'd just like to make is that, yes, there is ground soakage in the Wairarapa, and including within the Wairarapa's urban areas, and this is quite a supported approach for managing stormwater. However, there are also other parts of the urban areas that discharge directly into stormwater networks, which then discharge to freshwater receiving environments. So having access to ground soakage stormwater options does not necessarily change my view on this matter. I'll also just briefly comment that groundwater soakage can also, depending on the connections to groundwater, lead to some contamination of downstream freshwater receiving environments. So that's that. I'll just briefly mention that I understand that there was discussion on Tuesday about whether there might be other ways for the relief sought to be integrated into the district plan. I've discussed this briefly in my evidence in paragraphs 44 and 49, and I acknowledge that there might be some alternative ways for this direction to be provided in the district plan, and I'm very open to working through this with the reporting officers if the panel is minded to that. One alternative option that I've considered, as opposed to a new Three Waters chapter, might be that you could integrate this into the general residential zone, the subdivision zone, the subdivision chapter and the centre zone chapters, where you could just potentially integrate it into the existing permitted and restricted discretionary rule framework. And I've given that a bit of thought. I won't go into that now into too much detail.
No, I know I'll address that in a moment.
I might stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions on the Three Waters chapter first.
That's a good idea while it's fresh in our mind.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to kick off before I do? Okay. The takeaway for the panel following day one of the hearings was that that the officers were of the view that that there is a residual function for the council in terms of implementing the MPSFM. They still maintain that the primary function and jurisdiction rests with the regional council in terms of section 30. They do acknowledge that in terms of section 31, there are some obligations on the district council to implement the MPSFM, particularly in relation to urban development and subdivision. So that's, I think I'm summarising the position accurately. The question then is how is that best, and in section 32, what's the most appropriate way of doing that? Whether it's a Three Waters chapter or whether it's through the inclusion, as you've just alluded to, the retrofitting of policies in a different zone and rules and standards also. We gave a soft signal to the officers that we saw some purchase in your concern that the current subdivision standards are focused primarily on servicing capability and capacity. That's not to dismiss some of the objectives and policies that do talk about environmental effects and the importance of protecting water, but we just wondered aloud whether that could be made more explicit. And so what we wanted to suggest is that the parties that are given evidence on this get together to consider that appropriateness question. Involve yourself, Mr. Wesney, probably also Ms. Foster for Meridian, and maybe Mr. Matthews for Genesis. They've been the only submitters that have provided expert evidence on the matter, and that's the purpose of to allow those experts to get together. So that's our thinking at the moment, and I'm hearing that you're amenable to that occurring.
Yes. Yeah.
That would need to occur in the next 5 to 10 days to enable Mr. Wesney and also Ms. Robertson, who would need to be involved in that also, to complete their right of reply. And so we would expect a joint statement to be presented, which shows the areas of agreement and disagreement. Where there is disagreement, I don't think there's any need to expand on that to any great degree because you can rely on your original position, but we would encourage, to the extent possible, agreement on what's the most appropriate way of achieving it. That sound reasonable to you,
yeah.
Mr. Wesney and Ms. Robertson?
Straight away.
Oh, Ms. Treadaway, sorry. Sorry. Not the first mistake I've made. Yeah. Do you, well, I don't propose that there needs to be facilitated. I think we're experienced operators and I think you could get together and work out the terms of direction. The question is whether it needs a minuted direction at all in that respect.
Suggest that at the end of today, we were going to go through a list of questions that have arisen from today and on Tuesday. And those questions we could highlight.
Okay.
To be
good idea.
On.
Thank you for that. That deals with the waters matter. And the same approach might relate to the question of how Te Mana Otuwai fits into the objectives, the strategic direction objectives, which I presume is the matter you're now going to move on to, is it? Yes.
Yes. Yes, I was just, while we were thinking about freshwater, I was going to start with the new strategic objective, NEOX, which was sought by Greater Wellington submission.
Yes.
I just want to note in my evidence, I'd suggested some rewording, and I'm aware that Ms. Foster of this objective to address some of the concerns that have been raised, and I'm aware that Ms. Foster, on behalf of Meridian Energy, considers that some further refinements might be possible to address Meridian's concerns with that objective. So I support that.
Yes.
And
of course, that's very fresh information for this panel and for Mr. Wesney also. So in fact, we haven't even heard from Ms. Foster yet on that. Well, I just spied that in her summary statement earlier this morning.
Okay, yeah. I guess I'll just briefly comment that I still think this objective is useful for the plan and I guess not yet provide specific direction on freshwater and MPSFM that isn't yet given by the other natural environment objectives. So the reporting officer mentioned NEO2 on Wairarapa Moana and NEO5 on integrated management. Yes. While these are really good objectives, I don't think they quite holistically capture what the Te Mana o Te Wai objective would be.
But I think the context as I read Ms. Foster's evidence and Mr. Wesney's position is that they have some serious concerns about whether the prioritisation is relevant. And I think Ms. Foster's attempted to deal with that in her revised wording. So
yes, and I support the wording that there's and will put forward later today. So I'll now move on to urban development. Firstly, I just wish to acknowledge and support the further amendments that have been put forward by the reporting officer on these objectives in response to my evidence. I consider that there's now really only outstanding relief on UFD 01, which is the one on urban form. And this outstanding relief relates to three matters: inserting compact urban form, recognising well-functioning urban areas, and recognising the role of Masterton as both an urban environment under the MPSUD and as a larger centre within the RFS centre. So firstly, Greater Wellington's submission sought that the terms compact and well-functioning were added to UFD 01 as a way to describe the urban form of the Wairarapa, and I supported this relief in my evidence. I maintain that the reference to compact urban areas would support alignment with Operative RPS Objective 22 and Policy 31, which seek to achieve a compact, well-designed and sustainable regional form. I also maintain the views expressed in paragraphs 46 to 48 of my evidence that well-functioning should be inserted into UFD 01 to recognise Policy 1 of the MPSUD. I'd just like to note, as a further support of this relief, I've had a look at the town centre zone. So this is hearing stream 2, the town centre zone section 42A report. Greater Wellington had submitted on an objective in the town centre zone seeking that there was reference added to well-functioning. In response to the submission, the reporting officer for the centre zone, Alice Falloon, has made the following comment in paragraph 220 of the Centre Section 42A report, and I quote, "I consider the strategic direction chapter would be the most appropriate section of the PDP for an objective focused on creating a well-functioning urban environment where the functionality of urban environments can be outlined. For example, this could be under Objective UFD 01 or Objective UFD 02 on urban growth, which sets specific direction that the Wairarapa's urban areas grow in a planned, efficient and structured way to meet future needs, ... So I'm actually inclined to agree with the Centre's reporting officer on this view that it's more appropriate to bring the concept of well-functioning urban environments in through the strategic direction chapter than through a specific zone, such as the town centre zone, which only applies in some areas, because the concept of well-functioning urban environments relates to industrial, commercial and residential uses, and as well as open space and transport matters. So I think it's therefore the most holistic place for this concept to be recognised in the strategic direction objectives. I'd just like to also highlight that, as I outline in my evidence, Masterton must give effect to the MPSUD as a Tier 3 territorial authority, and that includes all relevant objectives and policies, including the key concept of well-functioning urban environments. So I also consider that all aspects of a well-functioning urban environment, which include things like housing variety, affordability, accessibility, adequate business land, climate resilience and climate mitigation, are relevant to the urban areas of all the main towns in the Wairarapa.
So I noticed that point in your sheet.
Yes, so yeah, I'd just like to reiterate that my evidence did spend some time making this point, that those principles of the MPSUD are relevant and useful for all the urban areas and so the main towns of the Wairarapa, and that as a combined district plan, I think it's useful to recognise them holistically in the context of urban development. I'd just like to highlight, again, going back to hearing stream 2, the reporting officer for the residential zones chapter has recommended that a sentence is added to the general residential zone to recognise this point to the chapter introduction of the general residential zone. But that would now state that the NPSUD's general principles are also relevant to the wider Wairarapa context, and its close connections with the housing and employment markets of Masterton, Wellington, and the Hutt Valley. And I really support the addition of this sentence. So, in summary, I therefore consider that the concept of urban areas being well functioning should be recognised by the PDP as an integrated and combined district plan, and that the strategic direction chapter is the best and the most holistic location to do so. So this could be either through UFD01, which is where the Greater Wellington submission originally sought it to be included. It could also be on the UFD02 on urban growth, which was an option highlighted by the Centre's reporting officer. In my opinion, I think UFD01 is the most appropriate place. So I maintain this relief sought as in my evidence. I have also considered whether a separate objective might be included to resolve this relief. I don't think this is necessary or very effective. And then the final outstanding issue on UFD01 is that I consider that the specific role of Masterton as a larger urban centre, it has more transport options and multiple centres, including a smaller centre like Kuripita, should be recognised through UFD01. I outline my reasons for this in my evidence. In my view, this best sits in UFD01, and I think it's important to recognise the particular role that Masterton has as a regionally significant centre in the Wairarapa under operative and proposed RPS Policy 31. So that's the urban development objective. I'll just briefly cover the other two objectives that I had addressed in my evidence.
If you just pause there, pen's run out. Have a spare pen. Thank you.
I did.
Thanks.
I'll just briefly cover the other two objectives that I had covered in my evidence. On the infrastructure objective, I accept the reporting officer's reasoning in their hearing summary statement, and I don't seek any further relief on this objective.
Thank you.
And finally, on CCR02 in the Climate Change and Resilience chapter, I'm still of the view that objective should recognise the specific connection to natural ecosystems. The reporting officer says that the wording I've put forward is focusing more on the how. While I acknowledge this, I think there are already several other strategic direction objectives that inevitably need to focus a little bit on the how. For example, UFD02 is describing the how of how urban growth should happen. It's not clear to me where else in the combined district plan this holistic connection between climate change and the potential role of natural ecosystems can be recognised, because that matter is then addressed throughout the district plan in, for example, the eco, the natural hazard, the zones chapters, the infrastructure chapters. And this feels like the best place to holistically make that connection between climate change and natural ecosystems. An alternative, if the reporting officer considers that the relief has shifted the focus of the objective too much, would be to insert a new objective to specifically recognise that connection and resolve the relief sought. So I suggest that you could basically take what I had, the wording I had suggested, and put it into a new policy. A new objective CCR05, which could be worded something like the ability for natural ecosystems and processes to help build climate resilience into natural and built environments is supported. And I've outlined in my evidence why I think that there's a lot of national and regional policy direction seeking that specific connection between climate change and natural ecosystems is recognised in the plan. So thank you for your time and happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you for that. I've got a couple of generic questions. Just as, are you able to update the family on the timeframe for decisions on RPS plan change number 1?
Yes, so there's a council meeting booked for the 26th of September.
And that meeting is
Yes, to
adopt recommendations. Panel will have a recommendation role or a decision-making role.
recommendation role.
And what's the process from there? Is there a split process?
Yes, it's going through two processes, partially under the freshwater process and partially under Part 1, Schedule 1. And so, at that point, the appeals will proceed for each one respectively, because there is also scope for some appeals on the freshwater.
Does the regional council make a recommendation back to the minister, or do they make a decision based on the freshwater process?
I'm sorry, I'll have to get back to you on the details of that.
Okay.
I can't confirm that.
Okay. And obviously the regional council will make a decision on the non-freshwater components, and that they'll be subject to the normal first schedule appeal process.
Yes, as far as I'm aware. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, can I just add as well that we're just working through at the moment how we could share that, maybe possibly even prior to the meeting, once the report's done with TAs and some other parties. So we'll definitely be in touch about that.
So is it a fair expectation that those decisions would be out in the month of October or November?
As far as yeah.
To know that, because that'll have an implication on the weighting of those provisions.
We can probably just provide a little bit more of a clear timeline update on some of those things.
That would be
next week. Yeah,
that would be useful. If we could have that by the end of next week, that would be useful.
Yep, we should be able to do that.
Can I email that to Ruth?
Yep.
Okay. Any questions of the regional council witnesses to my right? Nothing? My left?
No.
Okay, well, that brings me back to this issue of conferencing. Panel was very keen to explore that option. I guess we'll be in a better position at the end of today once Ms. Foster and also from Mr. Wesney, Wairarapa, who provide some direction. Probably will issue a minute, but it won't be incredibly detailed because we want to give you flexibility, but it will identify the key areas that we like the parties to conference on. And obviously the Three Waters chapter, the new objective on Te Mana Aotearoa, and maybe some of these subsidiary issues dealing with form development. That's all that I have at this stage. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for the legal submissions from DLA Piper. They were very useful. And as you say, Mr. O'Brien, those submissions will serve us well in subsequent hearings. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, amazingly, we're still only 7 minutes behind time. Probably the most surprised.
That mean you're going to cut our lunch?
Well, slightly shorter, but that's fine. Just for Ms. Foster's benefit, we're just going to take a 2-minute break just to stretch our legs and get some of our papers in order. So just bear with us over the next 2 minutes, please.
Understood. Thank you.
Ms. Foster's statement. Back, everybody. Thank you for that indulgence. I definitely benefited from a stretch. Welcome again, Foster. Presume you were listening in on the last session.
Yes, I was. It was very useful to have done so.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to read your statement in full, if you don't mind. And it may be that we pause at the end of each natural break, and if we have any questions, and by all means, you would have heard my suggestion also about conferencing. Are you amenable to that?
Yes, I was just looking at my diary to have discussion about dates with Mr. Wesney. Yes.
Well, certainly we can give some flexibility on that, because we don't want to constrain the discussion in any way, and if that means an extension to the right of reply at the other end to facilitate the conferencing, we're amenable to that.
I'll do what I can to fit in, and I'm sure my client will support that.
Okay, thank you. Well, I won't interrupt you.
In other words, pay for me to be there. Thank you. Tēnā tātou katoa, anō. I just wanted to record apologies for company representatives from Meridian. I'm here as their planning consultant, and I don't speak on their behalf. I advise them, and sometimes they take my advice. So just an apology on behalf of Andrew Fairbairn. I'll supply Ruth's spelling of his name later, and she may already have it, and Andrew Guerin, who would have been here, but for the fact that one is overseas and the other is currently involved in a hearing out of town elsewhere. So I appreciate that. So I'll start at 1.2. In the following notes, I address the few matters that are not agreed between my evidence and the reporting officer's reports and statements. And I'll just add that there are several other matters you'll have seen addressed in my evidence. The officer's amendments suggested in their summary statements have resolved most of those issues. And unless there are questions about those, I won't canvass those in any detail. So my update following my reading of the officer's reports is as follows. So on the first matter of the additional objective requested by Meridian Energy and Genesis Energy addressing strategic issues to do with renewable electricity generation, Mr. Wesney does not support insertion of that additional objective. The objective reads as given there. In 1.2, Mr. Wesney states that he understands the strategic basis for adding this objective to the PDP, but is concerned about duplication of similar objectives in the ENG energy chapter. I have read again the PDP in this respect. There is no equivalent objective in the energy chapter that draws together the strategic issues addressed by the proposed objective above. It remains relevant and important in my view for the reasons I've explained in my evidence, to include the additional objective in support of the other strategic objectives addressing climate change adaptation. There is higher order legislative direction and government policy guidance in relation to climate change, which elevate the CCAR matters as strategic issues. Equally, there is NPS REG, which underlying the strategic importance of renewable electricity generation in a district with known renewable electricity generation resources. None of the current CCR objectives give effect to the higher order NPS REG at a strategic level or draw these interrelated issues together in the way proposed by the proposed objective above. The energy chapter gives effect to the basic requirements of the NPS REG 2011, as you observed on Tuesday, Mr. Chairman. It does so only, in my view, in that basic way. But the world has moved on since 2011 with the urgency of climate change adaptation and the role of renewable energy in that adaptation, assuming much more importance recently, including in government policy, emphasising the role of renewable electricity generation in that role. It is this shift that warrants a strategic response in the PDP, in the strategic objectives section, in my opinion.
Thank you. If you
Happy to
wouldn't
take
mind,
questions on that.
yes, if you wouldn't mind. When you refer to higher order legislative direction and government policy guidance, and then go on, you're not obviously referring to the NPS REG because that.
No.
What are you specifically referring to there?
I'm referring to the climate change and emissions reduction legislation, climate change adaptation, but the spawning of the Climate Change Commission and the work of that, the independent advice of that commission and the response of government to that advice, which includes targets for emissions reduction, explicit strategies promoting the role of renewable electricity generation, 2050 ambitions for renewable, 100% renewable by 2050. And these are matters that I canvassed in my statement of evidence. So it's the legislation and the Climate Change Commission and the advice the government has taken and acted on, and their very brief, one has to say, climate change strategy released recently.
Yes, in a RMA sense, how do we get to consider those matters? If I can just provide some context, it's clear that in relation to the NPS REG, the directive is that the plan must give effect to that NPS. What's the linkage or nexus between the plan and those higher order legislative matters that you've just outlined?
I agree with you that they don't have quite the heft of an NPS, but I think they are relevant matters for the issue at hand. So they don't fit naturally into a hierarchy as required by the RMA, but I don't think they're matters that you can reasonably overlook because the issues make them live.
Yes. Are they? I don't have this. Are they matters that Section 74 requires to consider?
I would have to have a look at that,
Yes.
which I can do quickly.
And I say unconfidently, Section 74. Don't have the act in front of me. But I know that when a panel was dealing with resource consents under Section 104(3), they can consider other matters. I just wondered in relation to district plan matters whether there was an equivalent provision to other matters.
Yes, no, I don't think that there is, but there isn't even a reference to relevant legislation. There is to regulations.
Yes. Is it 74 or did I have that wrong?
Correct.
It is correct. It is, okay.
Yeah. that's the things they must be in accordance with.
Right, section 7, trade competition.
I think to the extent that it's relevant, there is a reference in 74 bracket 2 bracket B, management plans and strategies prepared under other acts.
Okay. That's sort of what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And what's the active verb or adjective to?
It is shall have regard to.
They'll have regard to, okay.
So I think the key nexus is actually through the strategy that the government released recently, but that is supported by advice from the Climate Change Commission, and there is the legislative duty on government to meet emissions targets. So to the extent that that might be considered strategy.
Okay, so that's a possible, and the panel considering, excuse me, those legislative matters, and the focus is have regard to, which is to if the DLA Piper submissions suggested we need to have give genuine consideration to, not just a cursory examination of. Okay.
Yes, I agree. And I think that you also need to have regard to it to the extent it is relevant and live, potentially in the district and not at a theoretical level. And I hope my evidence has demonstrated that it is a live issue for these councils. Okay.
My second and final question on this topic, Ms. Foster, is it relates to the MPS REG itself. You've made the point that none of the current DCR objectives give effect to that MPS at a strategic level, and you've also looked at the energy chapter, and you're saying that it gives a basic recognition of the requirements of the MPS in your view.
Yes.
Yes. If the new objectives that you've recommended, CCR 05, is not added, would the plan be giving effect to MPS REG?
I think that it's fair to say that the energy chapter does what the objectives of the NPS require, which is it recognises and provides for renewable electricity generation. So that's true. But I think it is relevant to note that the NPS is under review currently. A draft of how it might look in future has been circulated. It's by no means settled, but the fact that it is out of date and not addressing current issues, I think, is well known now. And I have tried to highlight what those current issues are. So I think that it is not just a question of in implementing something that was devised in 2011, but looking at the environment that is today, but more importantly, the future that we face during the life of this combined plan, which I think is there is a more than an existential, it's a real set of issues to be addressed. And the plan does so at the moment in addressing adaptation to climate change. And I think that there is a place for considering how the plan might facilitate and enable actual responses to that. So in other words, energy companies like Meridian represent part of the response to that. And the response in a plan cannot simply be to say, we'll all become resilient. It must also look at what's required to achieve that, I think. So that's where the shift and the emphasis, I think, of the district plan might be and could helpfully include objectives to that end. So panel will not be surprised to learn that Meridian made submissions in a similar vein on the RPS change number 1. And if Meridian is successful with those, we'll find out after the council's deliberations soon. But it will have similarly quite a different emphasis in recognising two sides to that coin, two sides to the climate adaptation. There's the protecting oneself, but also providing for an economy that is going to look very different in the future. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Two things there. I mean, clearly we can't second guess what the outcome of the review of the MPS will be. We've got an indication, but
That's right.
it doesn't have any legal effect, does it?
No, it has none at the moment.
No.
That's right.
Yep.
And I haven't relied on it in any way at all, but
Right.
I'm conscious of it, and I encourage the panel to be conscious of the issues, because they are future issues and they're real issues.
Yeah. Given that we have to give effect to an operative RPS and also have regard to any proposed RPS, what can you tell us about policy provision in the RPS that Meridian have been focusing on that forum?
Very similar theme, I suppose. The RPS, in my opinion, features a lot of promotion of climate change adaptation, a lot of protection of the environment, but seems to not consider how some of that climate adaptation, how that sustainable transport network, for example, is going to be achieved. And Meridian submissions have been focused on ensuring there are no unnecessary obstacles and there is relevant objective and policy support enabling the development of electricity generation opportunities that are going to provide the solutions that the objectives and policies in the RPS want. It's as simple as that. It provides half the picture, somewhat naively, in my view.
Yes. Is it possible for the panel to see the final recommendation of the officers on this matter at the RPS plan change level?
Yes, those are all publicly available documents, I think.
Yes, we would prefer that they came in to us rather than researching them themselves.
Sure.
Is that something that you could assist with?
Absolutely. I think there's some responses there. So I'll dig that out and get it to you within whatever timeframe Mr. Wesley needs.
Thank you. I've just got one final question on this topic, and I know that Commissioner Plimmer.
No, I want to ask you actually, just relevant. Because that's probably what she's talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I've just found in the Climate Change Response Act 2002 in Schedule 2, it actually specifically states that we must give talk about development and increased use of new and renewable forms of energy. So it's actually in one of the acts that for us. So
thank you. Thank you for knowing what I should have.
That's something we should have regard in terms of Section 74 to
yes.
I think. Mr. Wesley's made an important point on day one about the role of strategic objectives and that they should be an outcome, but they also shouldn't just replicate the higher order document wording. They need to be nuanced to the particular district. And in this case, you've made the point that renewable energy has a particular place in the Wairarapa district. Does that give any further impetus to a strategic objective such as ECR 05?
Well, I think that the wording that's proposed there draws a number of issues, strategic issues together. None of the current CCR objectives in my reading actually do this by way of responding to quite an obvious combination of highly integrated issues. So, and it responds to the reality, I think, of the Wairarapa. So it was crafted with exactly that in mind.
Okay,
I hope you will agree.
time will tell. Okay, unless there are any further questions, ask you to proceed at 1.4.
Thank you. The next was what Ms. Zollner was discussing earlier on the GWRC request for a Te Mana o Te Wai objective. It was discussed on Tuesday, and I did observe the recording of the hearing where you had questions from Mr. Wesley about that. So I have conferred with Ms. Zollner about my view that in relation to Te Mana o Te Wai, the NPS freshwater management requirement for district plans is confined to the effects of subdivision use and development of land on freshwater.
Yes.
So if an objective is to be included in the combined district plan, it is my view that Ms. Zollner's proposed wording should be amended to reflect this. So just to depart from it, the important difference is that as currently worded in her statement of evidence, Ms. Zollner's suggestion is that the principles of Te Mana o Te Wai, or the hierarchy of obligations, the prioritising of the needs of water, the needs of human health and other needs, be applied to all land use, subdivision and development. And my contention is that that is not the mandate given by the NPSFM. The mandate given is to apply that hierarchy to the effects of subdivision use and development. So subtle but important, and I've discussed that with her and she agrees. I note that just in that regard, in support of that view, that the legal submissions from the Regional Council point to the NPSFM Part 3.51, which deals with integrated approach and interconnectedness, and that's why I'm comfortable with an objective if it goes in that deals with the effects of subdivision use and development of all land, not just urban land. And secondly, 354, which is the duty that you have to include objectives, policies and rules to deal with the effects of urban development specifically. But I don't think you're confined to just dealing with the effects of urban development. 1.5, Ms. Treadaway's view is that the proposed district plan already includes objectives, policies and methods that address the measures specified in Part 3.54 that I referred to above. In my opinion, there is nothing in the higher order of policy instruments that directs that a district plan must include an objective to replicate the hierarchy of obligations set out in the objective in Part 2.1 of the NPS. I have reviewed the provisions of proposed change 1 to the Wellington RPS. There's nothing in that proposed change that directs territorial local authorities to include an objective mirroring the NPSFM hierarchy of obligations either. There is a proposed new objective, RPS Objective 12, that inserts the 6 principles of Te Mana o Te Wai from Part 1.34 of the NPS, and that includes D, which is the governance. The responsibility of those with authority for making decisions about freshwater to do so in a way that prioritises the health and well-being of freshwater now and into the future. Again, this is not a direction to district plans, and I note that there are submissions opposing the proposed Objective 12, which remain unsettled. We'll find out their fate quite soon. So the 6 Te Mana o Te Wai principles are relevant anyway for decision-making about applications involving freshwater resources by virtue of Section 104 of the Act, which requires consideration of the NPSFM. So even if the 6 principles are not included in Objective 12 in the RPS, they're still made live by the Section 104 requirement to consider the NPSFM. And the NPSFM and the RPS, including proposed change 1, are matters that must be given regard when considering applications. Yes. They are also to be implemented for in relation to the use and development of freshwater through the regional plan. So that's policy, objectives, policies and rules for the use and development of water. In relation to the use and development of land, they are to be implemented through regional plans, that's the Natural Resources Plan, and could also be implemented through district plans. And as the Greater Wellington Regional Council legal submissions have highlighted, this would be consistent with the Section 31 functions of territorial local authorities. So And I just to perhaps anticipating a question, but I take a slightly different view from Ms. Treadaway and Mr. Wesney on this, in that I do think that there is a clear mandate for territorial local authorities to include in a district plan objectives, policies and rules that address the effects of land use, subdivision and development on freshwater in an explicit way. And I think that the discussion earlier highlighted to me the merit of perhaps working one's way through the list of objectives and policies that Ms. Treadaway included in her statement and just running them past the ruler in part 3.54 of the NPSFM to see whether they do indeed address the well-being of freshwater in the way anticipated. So, and then that leads one to conclude whether the objective requested by GWRC might be a simple way of doing what part 354 actually does. But we can explore that at conferencing.
Yes, that's
so
fine.
I set out there So I've just set out there the wording that in exchange I reached out to Ms. Zillner to suggest that it might be refined to focus on the effects of. So that's why and going back to the governance clause of the principles of Te Mana o Te Wai, talking about people in decision-making authorities. So, and that would include decision-making about rules and land uses. I've phrased this objective, suggested phrasing it as where there are effects on freshwater, decision-making about those must prioritise the hierarchy of obligations. The key difference from Ms. Zillner's original proposed wording is the focus on the effects of land use, subdivision and development on freshwater rather than applying the hierarchy to all land uses and subdivision. To answer any questions about that.
No real question other than to be fair to Mr. Wesney and Ms. Treadaway, I think there is an acceptance that under 354 there is a role for the district plan. The question is,
I heard that.
Yeah. The question is what's the most appropriate way? And
I think that's fair.
And I do like
and I see I see these as processes rather than contests. So yes, that's a good approach, I think.
And I do like your suggestion of using 354 as the ruler to determine whether there are appropriate objective policies and rules to deal with the effects of urban development. And then once you've reached that conclusion, then you could then go on to address whether there's a need for an addition to the strategic objective in the way that the council have suggested and you've really commented on. Where does that, I'm just looking ahead in terms of your evidence and your statement, where does that leave the issue of the Three Waters chapter? Were you implicitly referring to that also?
Meridian's not interested in the Three Waters chapter.
Okay.
It's not that they're disinterested, but they're not a party to. They have no submission point on the Three Waters chapter.
Okay, I think it was Mr. Matthews of Genesis that took a view on that.
Possibly.
Yep. Okay. 1.9.
Yeah. It's a lot less heady perhaps from here. 1.9 about, and 2.1, I beg your pardon, I'm getting confused. Just 1.9 about objective RE03, highly productive land. Mr. Wesney has adopted the wording amendments I proposed to better reflect the NPS-HPL. And he has proposed also inserting subdivision, and I commented on that earlier today. I've also heard, of course, Ms. Levinson's comments on behalf of Horticulture New Zealand, and I stand by my suggestion in this in my evidence and in the statement that the inclusion of protection from inappropriate land subdivision use and development of highly productive land is still appropriate. And my reasons for saying that are these: that the NPS HPL could have, if it wanted, directed territorial local authorities to include an objective in district plans replicating the objective of the National Policy Statement. It does not do that. So the objective of the NPS is a national objective to protect land. And a full reading of the NPS tells you that it wants that done in a particular way. And what comes through very clearly is that it is protected from inappropriate subdivision, use and development. And I would say that that expression embraces the notion of reverse sensitivity that Ms. Levinson was concerned about. I don't know of anything that would sit outside that definition, if you like, of inappropriate subdivision, use and development. That is the concern of the NPSF HPL in district plans, and that's my reason for saying that you can, in my opinion, tailor your objectives to do what the NPS HPL wants in a way that is appropriate to your district. So, and again, I don't think that that it is correct to say that the NPS HPL demands the protection of all highly productive land in an absolute sense in all circumstances. It's very clear. And I would take you to policy 3.9, which sets it out explicitly. So the objective is a national objective and you have to implement it. So I hope that's helpful. Happy to ask any questions on that.
The question I have is, are there other NPSs that do have mandatory directives in them to counterbalance what you're saying about the NPS HPL not having a mandatory objective?
Yes, the NPS FM does have mandatory policies. It could have mandatory objectives, but it certainly has mandatory policies.
Yes. I was thinking
of fish passage, I think. Fish passage, consideration of applications for use of water and rivers, extent of loss of natural state rivers. Yeah.
Yes. I was thinking of also the NPS UD, which has some mandatory objectives and policies that councils must give effect to.
That's true. Yes, that's true. And this one notably does not.
Yes. Understand the point. We can move on to the next issue.
Okay, very good. So that is 2.1, I think, objective RE4, character of the rural environment. It's not a particularly contentious point, really. From Meridian's point of view, I take a different view from, I think, Mr. Ensor, who you heard from earlier. I think that the character of the rural environment includes its amenity values, but I think it's important that the expression is amenity values. We're not talking about whether you have a swimming pool or a library. We're talking about amenity values as defined in the RMA. So Mr. Wesney has, Mr. Wesney agrees with me. Mr. Wesney and I have different grammar. I've just suggested that the is might be an R. They're very, very minor points. So if there are no more questions about that, I'm happy to move to 2.2, the additional objective that is proposed for the rural environment chapter, not the general rural zone, but the rural environment, the overall chapter. Mr. Wesney doesn't support the request by Meridian Energy, I think, or I think it's Genesis, supported by Meridian, to include that wording. And in 2.3, Mr. Wesney does not consider there is a gap in the PDP because the energy chapter already recognises and provides for renewable electricity generation throughout the district. And that is true. But it remains my view that the PDP does not confront the reality that the rural environment, and specifically the general rural zone, is likely to be the only feasible location for large-scale renewable electricity generation activities. I think that is a truth. None of the PDP objectives address this particular point, and it remains my view that there is merit in including that additional objective.
Would you cite the same rationale for including that as you have in relation to the earlier objective CCR?
It's related to, but slightly different. I think that it's just addressing the point that it is this zone where people need to expect exploration and proposals. That is a reality facing all communities in New Zealand in the future. So it's really just the heads up, rural zone, this is where it's likely to be, and that it is a legitimate activity in principle, subject to careful site specific assessment in the rural zone.
Yes. There are two concepts in that what seemingly a simple objective, the availability, and the second is contribution to climate change targets. On the second concept, is that a duplication of what might exist in CCR 05 if the panel was to accept that?
I think that's a fair observation, and when I corrected myself before, I think this is a genesis, so there's been no kind of getting together and writing this in a nice coordinated way. So you're probably right about that. I'd accept that. Yes, yeah.
And
if CCR is included,
yes,
the last part of this objective would not be necessary in my view.
Okay. And what is the term is available? What does that mean in a practical sense? And what direction is that sending to the lower, or sorry, the not the lower order, but the chapters that sit below the strategic direction objective?
So it's attempting to be worded as an outcome rather than a to-do policy. So it's an outcome where that renewable electricity generation should be anticipated somewhere in the general rural zone.
Does that speak to activity status in the rural zone for that?
Yes, and that matches what is proposed, which is discretionary activity. Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's not a statement that it's anticipated everywhere, or but it's responding to one of the policies in the 2011 NPS for renewable electricity generation, which is to try to ensure that there are no undue obstacles. So just turning that on its head to say that it is provided for. So the rules provide for it as discretionary. It is contemplated, and this is just an explicit statement of that.
Yes. Can you recall the particular policy that references the no undue obstacles?
I will just have to, it's up on screen, and I can email that through. I think that's, I can never put my finger on them when I need to. Apologies.
You did reference policy 9 earlier, I think. Was it 3.9? Was it
3.9 of the highly productive land?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry, you did too.
The summary, yeah, I read it this morning, but I just haven't refreshed my memory on the REG.
You could
if I'm awfully clever, I'll bring it up. I'm not that clever.
Okay. Let's move on to 2.4.
Thank you. So this is the infrastructure objective. Mr. Wesney has accepted the evidence on behalf of Environs and inserted reference all to additional infrastructure. He has retained the amendments that recognise and provide for infrastructure and the language avoided, remedied or mitigated rather than well managed, as was suggested in Meridian's submission. The addition of additional infrastructure is annotated in blue onto his section 42A report recommendations, and I've just reproduced that below. Meridian's interest in this matter, is to ensure that the wording recommended by Mr. Wesney is not upset by further amendment, perhaps as requested by Environs, and to ensure there is clarity about what is understood to be infrastructure and additional infrastructure. The officers have not included a recommended definition of additional infrastructure. I heard the discussion on the opening day of the hearing on what is included in the NPS UD definition of additional infrastructure. And I note that the submitter that's seeking this amendment operates waste recovery and recycling facilities and clean fills. It isn't clear to me that the NPS UD definition includes these as community or network infrastructure, but I consider the PDP would benefit from the clarity of a definition of some sort, but having said that, it's probably more appropriate for the submitter or the reporting officers to suggest that, and it might be a matter for a future hearing stream. So just a very minor point.
I don't have any questions on that matter. Thank you, Ms. Foster. I'll just check with the panel, any residual questions? And what I'm doing, Ms. Foster, I'm just giving the officers an opportunity to seek any clarification through me of anything that you've said.
Stand by.
The only point would be conferencing Ms. Foster and Mr. Matthews of objective that are seeking.
Yes.
Might be an opportunity there to.
I don't know if you heard that, Ms. Foster.
No, I didn't. It was a bit garbled. Sorry.
It was just
Sorry, Mr. Wesley.
No, oh goodness, Foster. It's just a suggestion that earlier suggestion conferencing on the Te Manawatu Wai and other freshwater matters that yourself, Mr. Matthews, and myself conference on the wording of renewable electricity generation objectives.
I'm sure my client would support that as well, and I'll try and make myself available. Yeah.
Yes, we'll address that. We'll address that matter with it at the end of this hearing. And as I said, we'll issue a short direction minute, but it won't be detailed. Don't want to strain necessarily, but it'll just talk about what we expect.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Foster. Thank you for your attendance. We'll hear from you in due course and move on to other hearing topics.
Thank you. I'll email through the answers to the 2 questions you've put to me. Thank you.
The recording.
Okay. Is Wairarapa? Thank you. Welcome, both of you. Apologies for running late. Thank you for patience. We'll hear from you and then we'll break for a lunch adjournment. Just before we hear from you, I need to check my notes. Craig, did you have a disclosure?
Just for the panel, and I'd just like to acknowledge that the submitter and myself are both elected members of the Marsden District.
Yes. And Joe, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge that Peter and I are also on the council.
Okay.
Marsden District.
Do you have any problem with the 2 commissioners hearing your submission and deliberating on the matters?
No, I don't, but I just want to say that I didn't submit as a councillor. I submitted as a
private individual. Yes, understood. That's a very important point to make. Thank you for that. We have your written statement. Your hands.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. Today I appear before you to talk to my submission, S103. Face to face, kanohi ki te kanohi, and the hope that you will give my submission serious deliberation. I was born in Masterton, and as a baby, I lived at Papua Marae in Greytown with an aunt. Then when I was a toddler, I went to live with another aunt in Nukutai Meha Meeting House in Carterton before it was moved to Cole Street, Masterton. I grew up knowing that I was Ngāti Kahungunu. Why am I telling you this? Because I want to emphasise, want to stress that we are similar, but we are all different. We have different backgrounds and we grew up hearing different words. Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa and Ngāti Rangitane are 2 distinct iwi that both have mana whenua over the Wairarapa. However, throughout this document, only the Ngāti Rangitane vocabulary is evidenced. I wish to have the vocabulary of my iwi inserted and the document too, so that I know that I and those who are of Ngāti Kahungunu descent, who grew up knowing this term, are included in this combined district plan. In that regard, I wish to see that wherever the term tangata whenua and referred into in the document, the term mana whenua appears also. And I've given an example, tangata whenua / mana whenua. I'd like to introduce my friend, Connie Ondido, who was also brought up in the Wairarapa, knowing that she was an uri, a descendant of Ngāti Kahungunu. I asked Connie to come along to show that I'm not speaking for just myself. I am not alone. There are other Ngāti Kahungunu people who feel as I do, who may feel that this combined district plan does not include them. Recently, I attended a meeting where Connie spoke passionately about growing up in the Wairarapa and hearing her elders using this term, mana whenua. For both Connie and myself, it is not a word that was created by the Crown during the treaty claims process. It was a word that our whānau used, and they knew it. We want to see ourselves reflected in this combined district plan. We would like to be included. I ask that you seriously consider my submission, S103, and that you include the term mana whenua in the combined district plan so that we can be included, so that this plan can be our plan as well. Thank you.
Connie, did you want to add to that in any way?
No, but if you want clarification in terms of tangata whenua and mana whenua, kei te pai tērā.
Yes,
Yeah.
happy to hear that.
Do you want clarification?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Tangata whenua is anybody that's born here. Tangata whenua. Mana whenua is it was given to you.
Okay.
And where the mana whenua is, you can stand up and kōrero. And nobody will tell you to sit down. Just stand. That's the difference between tangata whenua and mana whenua. You're given the mana and you use it appropriately. Tangata whenua can be anybody.
Would using both terms send mixed messages to the reader of the plan?
No, if you're brought up with that kind of concept, no, you know the difference. It safeguards you.
Okay, well, let's see if there's any questions to Joe and Kiriana. Do you have any questions on that?
Oh, thank you for coming along and speaking at it though. And it's so in the other things that I've read from iwi, they're saying differently to that. So I wondered, have you had other discussions with iwi about before I came in about having the tangata whenua, mana whenua?
I guess I have, but it was the loudest voice at the time that was included in the writing of the document, and I acknowledge that we are different, but for those of us who know this term, we'd like to be included in the plan as well.
Sure.
Thanks, Kiriana. Just before you go, Mr. Wesley, this is going to impinge on your reporting. Do you have any questions or clarification?
No. I was party of a number of the conversations. I understand the point being made.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in. That adjourns the morning session at 12:44. So we're running a little bit behind time. Around about 14 minutes. So our next minute is due at 1:30. Do you think we can? Timeframe? I think we'll stick with the timeframe and we'll take a 45-minute lunch adjournment and be back here at 1:30.